There were no armies on the horizon, no enemies gathering in the distance, no battle to be fought. And yet, something was wrong. Inside the royal palace at Babylon, the most powerful man in the world lay still, surrounded not by war, but by silence. For years, Alexander the Great had been unstoppable. He had crossed continents, destroyed the Achaemenid Empire, and marched farther than any king before him. His army had followed him through deserts, mountains, and battlefields that should have ended them. Nothing had stopped him. Not kings, not armies, not the limits of the known world. So when the rumors began, no one believed them. A fever, weakness, impossible. Outside the palace, soldiers gathered, waiting, not for orders, but for answers, because something had happened that no one was prepared for. Their king was no longer commanding, he was fading. And in that moment, something far more dangerous than death began to spread. Uncertainty. Because if the man who held the empire together was about to fall, what would happen to everything he had built? At the time of his illness, Alexander the Great stood at the absolute peak of his power. From Greece to Egypt, from the ruins of Persia to the edges of India, his empire stretched across continents. It was not just vast, it was unprecedented. No ruler before him had moved so fast, conquered so much, or reshaped the world so completely in such a short time. And yet, he was not finished. In Babylon, plans were already forming for the next phase. Arabia was being prepared for invasion. Naval expeditions were being organized. New routes, new territories, new campaigns. There was always another horizon to reach. To Alexander, there was no such thing as enough. Victory was not an endpoint. It was momentum. But beneath that momentum, something critical had been left unfinished. There was no stable system holding the empire together, no clear structure that could survive without him. Control existed because he enforced it through presence, through command, through the absolute loyalty he inspired in his army. The empire was unified, but only through him. And that meant something dangerous. If he stopped, everything stopped. It began quietly, a fever, a weakness that seemed, at first, insignificant. For any other man, it might have been a warning. For Alexander the Great, it was something to ignore because he had never stopped before. Even as the fever worsened, he continued to give orders. Plans were still discussed. Commands were still issued. To those around him, it seemed as though nothing had changed. But something had. His strength was fading. Day by day, the symptoms grew worse. Movement became slower. Speech became strained. The energy that had once driven entire armies forward began to disappear. And still, he refused to accept it, because accepting it meant something unthinkable, that he was no longer in control. This was not just physical decline. It was the collision between identity and reality. Alexander had built himself into something more than a king. He was a force, an unstoppable presence that defined the direction of history itself. But now, his body was failing him, and no strategy, no courage, no battlefield brilliance could stop it. For the first time in his life, there was nothing to conquer. As the illness deepened, the illusion of control began to break. At first, it was subtle. Orders became less frequent, conversations shorter. The energy that once filled every room he entered began to fade into something quieter, something uncertain. Then came the moment no one could ignore. He could no longer speak clearly. For a man whose power rested on command, on the ability to direct armies, to decide outcomes, to shape events with his voice, this was more than weakness. It was collapse. The soldiers, who had gathered outside the palace, began to understand what was happening. They had followed him across the world. They had trusted him through impossible battles, and now they could not even hear him. According to accounts, the army was allowed to pass by him, one by one, not to receive orders, not to prepare for war, but to see him, to confirm for themselves that what they feared was real. Their king, the man they believed could not be stopped, was lying silent, unable to lead, unable to command, unable to continue. In that moment, something fundamental changed. Authority was no longer absolute. Because authority is not just a title. It is presence. It is control. It is the ability to act. And now, that ability was gone. The empire still existed, but the force that held it together was slipping away. As it became clear that Alexander the Great would not recover, a question began to form. Quietly at first, then with growing urgency. Who would rule? It was a simple question, but it had no simple answer. There was no clear successor, no established system to determine who would take control of the vast empire he had built. His son had not yet been born. His half-brother lacked the capacity to lead. And so, the responsibility fell to the men who stood closest to power: generals, commanders, men who had fought beside him, who had helped build the empire, and who now saw an opportunity within its uncertainty. Among them were figures like Perdiccas, Ptolemy I Soter, and Seleucus I Nicator, each powerful, each ambitious, each capable. When the question was finally brought forward, the response attributed to Alexander was simple: to the strongest. Whether those exact words were spoken or not, the meaning was clear. There would be no peaceful transition. Power would not be given. It would be taken. And in that moment, before he had even died, the unity of the empire began to fracture. Because without a clear center, every man began to see himself as the center. When Alexander the Great finally died in 323 BC, the world did not stop. It broke. There was no single moment of collapse, no dramatic fall of cities or final battle that ended the empire. Instead, it unraveled, quickly, quietly, and inevitably. The generals did not unite. They divided. Territories were claimed. Alliances formed and broken. Trust disappeared, replaced by calculation and ambition. What had once been a single empire became multiple competing powers, and soon, the conflict became open. The Wars of the Dacidae began, years of struggle between those who sought to control what Alexander had left behind. This was not an external threat. It was internal collapse, because the empire had never been built to exist without him. It had been driven by one man's vision, one man's command, one man's presence. And when that presence was gone, so was the unity. In the end, Alexander achieved something no one else had. He conquered the known world, but he left behind a truth that would define every empire that followed. Power can build something extraordinary, but if it depends on one man alone, it will not survive him. If you want to understand how empires rise, expand, and collapse, subscribe for more cinematic war stories. Because in history, the greatest victories often carry the seeds of their own destruction.